Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone is logging in from their previous session. I know some of them went right up to the limit here. So we do have people that are logging on right now. This is Barry Tonning from Tetra Tech, and I'm just going to do a very short introduction of our next speaker here while people are logging in. We have a presentation now on financing. And let me get my agenda up here. It is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started now with Ellen Kohler from the Environmental Finance Center as people log in. So Ellen, I see you've got your slides up, I think, so you can take it away.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Good morning. My name is Ellen Kohler. I am the Program Director for Water Resources at the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. I'm going to launch into part one of financing stormwater management. We're going to do an additional part two section tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. If you are able and awake to join us. So this is going to be a higher level conversation. We have specific sessions on fees and on state revolving fund resources. So there'll be more detail in the other sessions. So just to give you guys a little bit of background for those of you that don't know, the Environmental Finance Center is one of 10 university-based centers around the country. We work in EPA regions. Our region is Region 3, so we work in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. We work with communities to protect natural resources by strengthening their capacity of decision makers to assess needs, develop effective financing methods, and catalyze action. Through direct technical assistance, policy analysis, and research, EFC equips communities with the knowledge and tools they need to create more sustainable environments, more resilient societies, and more robust economies. In addition to our project-based work, we have two flagship programs, the MOST Center, which is the Municipal Online Stormwater Training Center, and Sustainable Maryland program, which is a certification program for municipalities in Maryland, similar to Pennsylvania's Sustainable Pennsylvania. So I want to start just with grounding us in our context in terms of how we manage stormwater generally in Pennsylvania. There are lots of different ways that we manage stormwater from different kinds of land uses. So industrial runoff from industrial sites is often managed through an individual Clean Water Act permit, a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System or NPDES permit, or through a permit that at the wastewater treatment plant, so that industrial runoff might run through that system to the wastewater treatment plant. So that's how industrial runoff is managed. Urban runoff is managed through the MS4 program, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Program, which is also part of the NPDES program. Construction runoff during construction is managed through Chapter 102. Post-construction runoff is managed under PA 167. And these are elements that have become elements of your MS4 programs. And then there's also non-point source. So places where runoff that gets to our streams through sort of disparate, in disparate places, not through an identified sort of place that here's where the runoff is coming up. And that's managed through the Section 319 program at the state level and through agricultural programs, often in partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and our conservation districts. So there's lots of different ways we manage stormwater. Our MS4 program is just one element of it. You and your communities know that you are looking at this situation right now in a changing context because of climate change. We live in a region of the country where we are experiencing a higher level of large storm events. And most of our communities were built at times when we have more impervious cover that did not have any kind of stormwater management. So this is creating a larger challenge for us in the Mid-Atlantic region than potentially in other parts of the country that are now just developing and can incorporate those kinds of management requirements in those developments. Because these large storm events also are challenging our systems and creating the potential for increased flooding, we also have different kinds of pollution threats as a result of climate change, that could be from chemical or industrial sites. So with that context, at the Environmental Finance Center, when we work with communities on their stormwater program development, we work through this process, and our first thing we do is, okay, where are you in this process? This is an iterative process, and one community might be at a point of trying to figure out its programmatic gaps. Another one might be ready to look at a financing strategy. So we figure out where the community is in this 5-step process. I do want to point out in the middle here, it's always about outreach and communicating with your community and your stakeholders. That's just a really important element. We've heard about that in some of the presentations already today. The MS4 permit, the current permit, required mapping. And I know that this was probably not the most joyful part of the permit. None of the permit was joyful, but I know that mapping was really challenging for a lot of communities. But I will just let you know that this mapping part is a really important step in assessing your community's stormwater program, right? So it's a really important part of step 1, understanding your current system. So getting that mapping done is a really important starting point. Then, depending on where you are in that process, you may have already assessed your current program, looked at your future needs and identified program gaps. Got to look at how you're going to develop your budget. And when you're looking at that financing strategy, what you're really doing is pairing up the activities that you need with the partners you're going to work with and the revenue sources that you have available to you. This combination is going to be different for every community. There's really not a boilerplate that works for everybody, but you're going to, so some communities, have a higher need for, in terms of engineering and planning, and they can do that in-house. Some of them may be needing to do those activities out, through contract engineers. We know that a lot of communities in Pennsylvania have contract engineers. You might be partnering with your conservation district. You might be looking at grants or fees. That combination varies for every community. There are several sources of funding for stormwater programs. This table lists the most common ones we see. Some of these sources involve debt financing and some are not. I do want to point out that Brian Johnson from Penvest made a point in one of the earlier sessions today that you do not have to have a fee program, a stormwater fee, in order to access Penvest loan financing, okay? You can do that based on your general fund dollars. You don't have to have a fee in place as a revenue stream. These different sources have different strengths and weaknesses. I'm not going to work through all of them. You'll hear more about some of these in the sessions, but I do want to point out that generally we have a challenge between funding capital, which means, implementing those actual BMP practices on the ground, and operations and maintenance of those facilities. Several of our funding sources don't provide revenue for operations and maintenance. So you really need to be aware of that when you're doing your budgeting. It's also really important to keep in mind the life cycle of your stormwater facilities. Now, those can be either gray or green facilities. They all have a life cycle. None of them are built to last forever. So we need to keep that life cycle in mind, and we need to understand that life cycle starts with putting in that practice, that facility. And generally, that's a pretty big upfront cost. But the operations and maintenance over the term of the life of that practice is pretty substantial and can be as much as 60 to 65% of the overall cost for the life of that BMP. And so that's really important to keep in mind as we're doing our budgeting. You're going to hear me hit on this operations and maintenance piece often because it's where most municipalities are not considering that in their financing strategies in the long term. So there are some obvious budget implications from what we talked about. So for what are those upfront costs for those best management practices that you've identified that you need to implement? And how does timing impact the municipality's cash flow? So if you're going to start implementing some BMPs right now, do you have that cash up front? Can you start funding it right now? If not, how are you going to get that funding in place? Is a grant program available that would provide the revenue at the right time, or is it going to provide the revenue a year from now? Is that okay? So you need to think about what you need to fund when and how those revenues come in terms of timing. We want to consider whether those BMPs are serving other community priorities. The session I was just in on the floodplain restoration project was an exemplary example of how to get those BMPs to serve all sorts of roles for your communities. You want every dollar you spend on your MS4 program to serve your communities and is in as many ways as possible. And that example, I can't, if you can go back and watch that later, if you weren't in that session, it's just great. It's helping provide flood capacity for this community. It's helping provide playing fields at a park for this community. It's providing the opportunity to free up some other private land for economic development. So just a wonderful, wonderful example of getting those dollars to serve your community in lots of different ways. And then there's the question of who should pay for what in your community. If this is a benefit that's going to be realized by a specific private property private property owner, what's their role? How can you get them engaged to help pay for that? And that goes sort of broadly across your entire community. If you are, if you're a community that has a strategy where you're using mostly your general fund dollars, most often that comes from a good share of that money comes from property taxes. Are all of the property owners who are generating a lot of stormwater paying property taxes? It's an important question to ask in your community. If you have a lot of nonprofit property owners, the answer to that question may be not enough are paying. And so you need to consider how who's paying and who should pay for what kind of BMP implementation. Some other considerations in terms of budgeting. You want to be able to track your costs of all your stormwater activities, from implementation through operations and maintenance through enforcement and compliance. So because doing it in a consistent manner across all of these different kinds of activities, because that's going to help you in your budgeting process and have a more accurate budget. Number two, consider that life cycle. I've already talked about it. I'm just going to reemphasize. It's really important to understand that building it is only one part of the cost. You got to look at regular maintenance and that those important points in that maintenance life cycle, but also replacement costs at the end of the life cycle of that particular BMP. And then finally, you want to protect your investment by including O&M costs, certainly in your budgeting, but ideally, if you can include it in the first 5 years of your project costs, so that you're actually thinking about it in capital terms, that would be really important if your community is willing to do that. We'd like to also start pushing grant funders to be thinking about this too, because really, if we're talking about green infrastructure specifically here, getting those plants stable and mature really does take 5 years. And so that BMP isn't really functioning the way that you want it to right off the bat. It really takes that establishment period. And so that's really a better way of being accurate in terms of how much it costs to acquire, quote unquote, using that term, that BMP. That is all I'm going to say for now. We're going to hit some more topics in the morning at 8 o'clock. And so I'm going to wrap it up here so folks can hop into their next sessions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ellen. Again, just as a reminder, please do hit the leave button and consult your agenda for the link to the next sessions, which start in 5 minutes at 11:20. And again, Ellen will be doing the part 2 of this financing discussion tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. So thanks, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.